In our lesson for January the 11th, we turn our attention to the book of Nehemiah. If you'll look at Nehemiah chapter 2, this is our text for this week's lesson. One of my favorite writers today is a man by the name of Leonard Sweet. He is a prolific author and a very intriguing way in which he writes. And one of the things I remember seeing the other day, he compared what he called a Hebrew proverb with what he calls a postmodern proverb. And the Hebrew proverb, he said, is where there is no vision, the people perish. And it's one that we've heard preachers and leaders have used that across the years. But he sets beside that what he calls the postmodern proverb, and the postmodern proverb says, where there is only vision, people have nervous breakdowns. And that's a great thought. It's one thing to have a vision and to say, this is what we're going to do. It's a totally different thing to be able to say, and here is how we're going to be able to do that. Unless you have a plan to go along with the vision, it often causes people to have nervous breakdowns. Nobody recognized that truth, I think, more than Nehemiah. I love Nehemiah. This is one of the great books of the Bible. Nehemiah recognized that you not only had to have a vision, but you also had to have a way that you were going to flesh out that vision. And the book of Nehemiah describes exactly how Nehemiah does that. So mark Nehemiah. We'll be in it a good bit of the rest of this quarter. We begin in chapter 2, verse 1 through 8 with what I call Nehemiah's burden. As the book opens, we see Nehemiah serving as the cupbearer, chapter 1, verse 11, to the king Artaxerxes, who is the ruler of Persia. Now, cupbearer, we think, yeah, it's not very important. Bearing his cup, how important could that be? But here is the person who was closest to the king, somebody who could determine what the king would drink, whether it was safe for him or not, and he had the ear of the king. So Nehemiah is in a very important position under King Artaxerxes in Persia. He is in Susa, which is the winter capital of the Persian Empire. And while he's there, he gets a message from a man by the name of Hanani, who reports to Nehemiah about conditions back home in Judah, in Jerusalem, and in the Hebrew promised land. And it's not a good report. He reports to Nehemiah that the people are flailing, that they are kind of struggling with their life. The walls of the city are completely demolished, and so the city is not being protected, and nobody is doing anything about it. Hanani brings to Nehemiah a very grim report of what's happening back home. Now, Nehemiah knows that he has to do something to alleviate the problem. But one of the things we see in Nehemiah is that he doesn't act without thinking through what he's going to do. He doesn't act until he determines a strategy to follow. And one of the hints of this is to see, look at Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. He receives the word about conditions back in Judah in the month of Kislev, which is December. And then look at chapter 2, verse 1. It says he brings this matter before the king in the month of Nisan, which is April. So he gets the message in December. He doesn't act until April. So he has December, January, February, March, all of this time in which Nehemiah is thinking through exactly how he needs to deal with this problem. The other thing we see about Nehemiah is that he doesn't act before taking the matter to the Lord. During these 4 months, he's not only thinking, but he's also fasting and praying about the situation back home. And so after 4 months of fasting and praying, he begins to lose weight, and his face begins to be a little, sinking down, and he loses weight. And the king looks at him one day and says, chapter 2, verse 2, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" And Nehemiah now is in a position to lay his plan before the king. The king says in verse 4, Nehemiah, what do you want? But notice that even here, he doesn't launch out on his plan until he first of all talks to the Lord. Verse 4 says, then I prayed to the God of heaven, and then I answered the king. So we see Nehemiah doesn't act before determining a strategy, doesn't act before laying this thing before the Lord. But once he does, he tells the king what's wrong, and the king gives him the authority to go back home and to rebuild the walls of the city. Chapter 2, verse 11 through 16 now, he is back home, and we see that same deliberate action that we saw in the previous section. Now, Artaxerxes has given him the permission to take a leave and to go back to Jerusalem to build the wall, and he immediately begins working on his plan. He asked the king for letters to all of the governors through the area, in the areas through which he will travel. So here we see Nehemiah thinking through things, making his plans. They're going to be going through all these different lands. Some of these governors are going to say, what are you doing? Are you running away? We're going to take you back to Persia. He'll say, no, here's the letter. The king gives us permission. So he's thinking through how he's going to deal with that. Then he also gets a letter to Asaph, who is the keeper of the king's forest, so that he can get from him all of the materials he needs to rebuild the walls when he gets back. So chapter 2, verse 7, chapter 2, verse 8 shows again the cautious preparation that Nehemiah makes as he heads back home. The preparation continues now in verse 11 when he finally does get home. Verse 11 says, I went to Jerusalem, so he's back home now, and after staying there 3 days, here again, he doesn't act the first day, he gets back 3 days, kind of gets the lay of the land. I set out during the night with a few men, and what he's doing is investigating the walls to see what kind of condition they're on. Verse 13 tells us that his inspection takes him from the valley gate to the dung gate to the forest gate to the valley gate, again demonstrating the thoroughness of Nehemiah's preparation. He doesn't just look out and say, I think we need to rebuild the wall. He takes a secret tour at night all the way around the wall, maybe so he won't be interrupted, maybe so he won't raise suspicion, but in this nighttime visit, he investigates personally to see what the need is. And what he sees confirms his worst fears. The walls are down, there's absolutely no protection for the city. It demonstrates a deterioration in the city overall. So Nehemiah, as he makes that night tour around the walls, not only confirms that something has to be done, but he begins to lay out in his mind the exact plans that he will follow to rebuild the walls of the city. Chapter 3, Nehemiah 2, verses 17-20, we see that Nehemiah begins to lay out his plan. Verse 17, he brings together the officials, the leaders of the city, back in verse 16. And he doesn't tell them what he's doing or what he was done, but he brings them together, verse 17. And as he rallies the people, he focuses on two things. Number one, the need facing them. Verse 17, you see the trouble we're in. He said, Jerusalem lies in ruins and the gates have been burned with fire. So the first thing he does, he presents them with the problem. The second thing he does is to encourage them with the promising word that they have the resources that will enable them to rebuild the wall. Verse 18, he says, come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And I told them that the gracious hand of the Lord was upon me, and the king had told me to come back and rebuild the wall. And so he said in verse 7, let us start rebuilding the wall. Now, how are the people going to respond? I think the answer to that question partly comes from what Nehemiah has done. He comes back. He doesn't just announce what he's going to do. He carefully lays out his plan. He investigates the walls. He knows that he has the support of the king. He feels that he has the presence of God with him. And so he has, as we would say today, all of his ducks in a row before he brings the people together. And he gives them every reason why this thing will work. And he immediately draws from the people a stimulating response. And verse 18 says, the people respond with confidence and they say, so, and the Bible says, so they began a good work. So all's good, right? I mean, everything's good. He's got the people rallied. They got the resources. They got the support of the king. They've got God on their side. It's smooth sailing ahead, right? Well, wrong. This is real life we're talking about here. And anytime anybody wants to do something, there are going to be people who oppose because it's going to bring about a change for other people. And that's exactly what we see in the story of Nehemiah. Verse 19 following, we see three different individuals who will rise up in opposition to Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the wall. One of them is a man by the name of Sanballat, who is the governor of Samaria. And he also has economic connections with some people who will be threatened economically and politically by the rebuilding of the wall. How will he be threatened? Well, if the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt, then that's going to make that a more important center for life in that area. It's going to make it more important for the trade of that area. And Sanballat, who's the governor of Samaria, which is another city, is going to be threatened by that. Tobiah is one who has political combinations. We'll talk about him in the next lesson. And Geshem is an Arab who has all kinds of economic connections. So Geshem from an economic standpoint, Tobiah from a political standpoint, and Sanballat really from both standpoints. These three rise up in opposition to Nehemiah. And we see two strategies that they use against Nehemiah. We'll explore more of these in a later lesson. But verse 19, first thing they do is try ridicule. Verse 19, they say, they mocked and ridiculed us, saying, what is this that you're doing? Are you rebelling? Well, that's the first phrase. What is this you're doing? And this kind of sarcasm in their voice. It's like, you think that you guys can put together, rebuild the walls of the city? And they try to shame them out of it. And then the second thing they do is to threaten them. And that's that second phrase, are you rebelling against the king? We'll see more of this opposition in the days ahead, but Nehemiah is not going to be denied what God has called him to do, and he's going to rebuild the walls, as we will see in succeeding lessons. You can see those three practical applications at the end, things that we learn from Nehemiah as he goes about the rebuilding of the wall of the city that we can apply to the task facing us as well today.